Hey writers, you're listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast, where we bring you insights and inspiration for growing your self-publishing business. We're your hosts. I'm Rachel, Author Engagement Manager at Kobo Writing Life.
And I'm Tara Kremen, Director of Kobo Writing Life. In this episode, we're chatting to Amy McCulloch. Amy is the author of international best-selling thrillers Breathless, Midnight, and Runner 13, as well as 8 novels for children and young adults. An adventurer, in 2019, she became the youngest Canadian woman to climb Manaslu in Nepal, and in 2022, she completed the Marathon des Sables, a 250-kilometer Saharan ultramarathon known as the toughest foot race on Earth. And currently, she resides in London.
I think it's a good thing that our podcast is given a time limit because I think that Tara and I could have taken Amy's entire day chatting with her about the incredible adventures she goes on and how they inspire her writing. We chatted with her about her writing process, about how life kind of guided her to become an author, and we really dug into Runner 13, her upcoming release, which takes place during an ultramarathon. We were both left feeling inspired. And if I end up signing up for an ultramarathon in the Sahara Desert, we know exactly who to blame. This was a great conversation, and I hope you enjoy. Okay, we are joined today by author Amy McCulloch. Amy, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Not a problem at all. I'm so pleased to be here.
To kick things off, can you tell our listeners just a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name's Amy McCulloch. I am the author of 3 thrillers inspired by my own personal adventures, including the upcoming Runner 13 and the international bestseller Breathless. Before that, I also used to write for teens and young adults, so I've had several books published in that sphere as well. I currently live in London, England, but I am originally from Ottawa, Canada, so yeah, kind of an international background.
Which isn't surprising to anyone who has read your books, I'd imagine, because they're so worldly, which we will jump into. But let's kind of go back to the start. And could you tell us a little bit about your writing journey and what motivated you to start writing and how you went from an aspiring author to a published novelist?
Sure. I mean, it was kind of funny because I always hear a lot of authors talk about how they were always big readers from childhood. And I kind of wasn't that really. But my parents were really encouraging of me to try and get me reading. So they would read to me every night and, they would really try and get me into stories. And it wasn't until they started reading me Agatha Christie and Nancy Drew books that I really started to get hooked on the idea of reading. And it was because of the cliffhanger chapter endings at the end of every Nancy Drew. And I was just so hooked. They would sort of read and then they would come to the cliffhanger and they would close the book. And I would say, no, you can't stop there. Like literally, I have to know what happens. And they say, no, you have to wait till tomorrow. Until, sort of genius baby Amy realized she could just take the book off the shelf and read the rest of it herself. And one night my parents came in and I had finished not only that Nancy Drew, but like a couple of others that were on the shelf. And it grabbed me. And from that moment on, I didn't stop reading. And so sort of mystery, that was really my sort of entryway into the genre. And then I started falling in love with books that my dad really loved, which was the sort of fantasy genre. He would read me Lord of the Rings, which at first was sort of went way over my head and then really became, a huge passion of mine. And I went to university. At first, I didn't really think that I didn't really think that becoming an author was like a viable career, but I knew that I loved to read, and so I actually started doing an international relations degree with a bit of English on the side. And then by the time I finished university, I was all in on English. So I was doing like old English and medieval literature in particular because I was really fascinated. Again, I think because of my fantasy-loving roots, by the kind of origins of the language and the origins of the stories, and also how funny and hilarious even medieval writers were, like Chaucer, or even going further back, just how funny and sort of graphic and interesting those stories were. But what I was starting to realize was that I was reading all these fantasy novels that were kind of inspired by that tradition, that kind of very rooted in kind of Western storytelling traditions at that time. And my mom is Chinese. And I had grown up, listening and hearing a lot about Chinese mythology and that kind of those stories. And I wasn't really seeing that reflected in the books that I could find in the library at the time. And I realized that the only way that I could write or that I could read those stories that I wanted to read, was to maybe try and write one myself. And I had this idea, and it was going to be set in, in a world that was more inspired by where my mom was from, and kind of took off from there. So I just had this scene in my head, and I wrote it. And I wrote the whole novel in my final year of university and tried to get it published and went through, at that time, it was still half querying by email and half sending off letters with a couple of sample chapters, and then receiving back this like your self-addressed stamp envelope with a nice sort of rejection. And I got rejected everywhere, as I think, authors kind of have to face at some point. It was just total rejection. And I was kind of like, well, that's why I didn't think being an author was a viable career. And I graduated from university, and I knew I loved books, so I knew I wanted to work with books, but I decided to take a year off and go traveling. And now part of the book that I had written had been set in kind of a desert environment. And when I was on my travels, I actually went and visited some deserts, the Namib Desert, the Sahara Desert. And when I came back from those travels, I rewrote the whole book again, because I still loved the core of the idea, and I still really believed in it, and I believed in the characters. But my craft was just not there at that time. But I learned so much through that. And then all sort of conjunction, doing this alongside trying to like get my first job in the real world. And at that point, I was trying to get into publishing because that's, I loved books so much. So I moved to London, England, and got my first job as an editorial assistant for a nonfiction publisher. So completely not the sort of thing that I had kind of dreamed about doing, but it was a job, it was paying me, and it gave me the opportunity to continue writing on the side. I finished that book, which was called The Oathbreaker's Shadow, and sent it off again to a bunch of agents, and again got mostly rejections, but then I got one positive. And it took so long after I'd sent out the query to get this positive back that I'd kind of forgotten that I'd even sent it to this person. I was just like, she got this email back, and I was like, oh my gosh, totally forgotten. And it was because it had gone to the assistant of an established agent. And I didn't know, but she was being made a full agent at the time. And she asked to meet with me because we were both in London. So we met, and she said, look, I know I don't have any credentials yet. I don't have any sales yet, but I'm a new agent at this very established agency. So I'm really hungry and everything. And she's like, I'd really love to represent you, and you'd be my first client and everything. And I was like, yeah, no one else is interested. She didn't know that, but no one else was interested. So I thought I'd jump at the chance and joined forces with her. And so she's been my agent for the past over 15 years, and she now represents some of the best-selling authors on the planet, like Richard Osman and Jessie Burton, and yeah, she's just become this phenomenon. And I was like, I was there first. But she sold that book for a really, really small deal, but it just changed my life completely, to Random House in the UK and to Random House in Canada. And then from then on, I've written a book a year for the last 15 years. With the exception of last year, which I took off to have my son. But it's been just a nonstop journey for me from that. And what I always really appreciate is that she sold that book for really, there was no splashy debut. There was no massive 6-figure deal, anything. It was under 5 figures. It was a 4-figure deal. It was a relatively small deal. But she believed in me and my writing so much that, we've been able to just keep growing. And she has that trust in my writing, which I think is crucial, like in this industry, is to have it only has to be one person, but someone who really believes in you.
It's so cool that the two of you were able to kind of forge your careers and come up in this industry together. And I'm so curious, as somebody who has worked on the other side of publishing, at what point in your author career were you like, okay, I'm doing this full time now?
Yeah, that was really tough because, as I said, these kind of two journeys were happening side by side. My writing and then my learning my learning how to be an editor in publishing. And it was really interesting because I actually loved it. I loved the publishing side of it. I soon moved on from the nonfiction job and got a job as an assistant editor at Harper Voyager. So that's sci-fi and fantasy publisher. That was, my dream role. I got to work on Game of Thrones. I got to work with some brilliant new and up-and-coming authors who've gone on to amazing things. And I loved the process of working with other writers. And it's very much a mentorship role, I feel, being an editor. No one, you don't, there's no course that teaches you, you're just learning from other editors in-house. And I learned so much from them, really brilliant women to work with, really. And I mean, obviously, it took me a little while to feel like I was earning enough money from my writing in order to kind of leave publishing. But when I made that decision, it was much more difficult than I thought it was going to be. When I left, I was editorial director at Penguin Children's. So I was in quite a senior role, and I was really enjoying it and getting to work with sort of on the children's and young adult imprints, which was, young adult was absolutely booming at the time. It was a really dynamic, fun place to work. And I sort of specialized in authors who were coming from not alternative paths, but I suppose I was, looking at Wattpad at the time. I was, looking at the blogosphere. I was looking at YouTube, where other new, fresh voices were coming from and different paths to publication. And that was really exciting for me, even as my own publishing journey was kind of going along on side. But I think eventually I realized that if I wanted to be, if I really wanted to take the author thing to the kind of next level, I needed to give myself that time and that space to kind of devote to writing. And it was a real leap of faith at the time to kind of leave the more secure role of publishing and the role that I really enjoyed. But I sort of had a hope that if everything had gone totally wrong with the writing and everything collapsed around me, that maybe I could go back to the editorial as well. Like that door would hopefully still be open to me. So I think that helped the decision, helped make the decision a little easier.
And you talked about YA there, and you started writing in kind of young adult and then have sort of transitioned to like real world thrillers. Did this coincide with you going full time, or was this kind of just, was it after the fact?
No, yeah. So when I went full time, I was writing almost exclusively YA. In fact, I went younger. I wrote a middle grade science fiction novel, which was great fun to do. I co-wrote a YA murder mystery with a very popular YouTuber here in the UK called Zoella. And those were great fun. And that's what I thought I would do for the rest of my career. I'd never actually thought about writing adult, but life had other plans for me. And it was interesting because, and I think this is something that maybe not a lot of authors talk about, but when I went full time, I had recently gotten married and I had a partner who had a really secure finance job. And so there was that feeling that, like, say everything had gone wrong and I needed a buffer. I had a partner who could hopefully support me until I kind of got through to that. So there was that financial cushion, or at least safety net, that I felt like was there. But sadly, as life happens, we ended up getting divorced after we took a kind of what was meant to be kind of a dream extended honeymoon traveling throughout South America. But it kind of revealed to us, as traveling can often do, that actually what we wanted out of life was really different. And I was kind of entering my 30s thinking, what do I want out of this life? Well, I want to write, and I want to see all of the amazing things that are out there in the world. And, being a writer and working in publishing can sometimes be I was a bit sedentary, to be honest with you. I wasn't doing much exercise. I wasn't really doing much of anything. But when we went traveling and we were sort of walking more and seeing more, I realized that's what I want to do. I want to be outdoors. I want to be challenging my body. I want to be seeing what I'm capable of. And I want to see all the wondrous things that are out there in the world. And unfortunately, those goals just didn't align with what my ex-partner had in mind for his life. He thought we were just going to go on this kind of adventure and then come back and kind of settle down and make roots and that kind of thing, which was completely valid. But we both realized that, our lives kind of gone in completely different directions. But obviously that divorce was, heart-wrenching for me, totally shifted my whole vision of what my life was going to be. We'd been together since I had been 20. So, 10-year relationship. And we'd always, had these plans for what our lives were going to be. And all of a sudden that path was now suddenly shut off to me. And I had no idea what I was going to do. And I was at a point in my writing career where things were going okay, but, nothing had really kind of taken off hugely. And all of a sudden now that was going to be my only support. I didn't have a financial safety net of a husband anymore. It was all on me. And it was really, really terrifying. And almost the day that he left, and I was completely on my own, I was like, I couldn't stay in the house that we were in. We were actually living in my parents' house at the time because we had taken this time off. And so we didn't have a fixed address. And I was like, I can't live in my parents' basement and just wallow the end of my divorce. So I was in Ottawa and I booked a flight the next day to Dublin. And I decided I was going to walk. And I had Googled some long distance walks. It was my wild, basically. And I decided I was going to walk the Kerry Way. And that's what I did. I walked the entirety of the Kerry Way on my own, screaming at sheep, wandering this beautiful Atlantic coastline, seeing the most incredible scenery. And I was blessed with incredible weather, which, Ireland's you're not always a given, but whatever happened, I was blessed with this incredible weather, the Skellig Islands, just these incredible, natural, beautiful places. And I realized, although things seemed to be crumbling in my life, there was a little part of me that thought, but now I can do these things, like now this path is open for me. And, where is life going to take me now? And I was hooked on walking. And so I decided my next trip after Ireland was going to be to Nepal because I'd never been. And I wanted to walk and see again some incredible scenery. I ended up doing the Annapurna circuit, which is an incredible hike in the high mountains, and you see some incredible 8,000 meter peaks. And the first 8,000 meter peak that I ever saw was a mountain called Manaslu, which is the first mountain you see if you do the kind of traditional Annapurna circuit. And it kind of stands on its own, so it's sort of it really takes your breath away with just how striking and how huge and sort of monumental it is in the space. And the hike was, again, more strenuous than anything I'd ever done, higher altitude. And I loved it. I absolutely fell in love with it. And when I got back, I just kept going. I did another mountain, or I did my first mountain, which was Toubkal in Morocco. And we ended up summiting that mountain on New Year's Day. So the sun was rising on a new year and we were reaching the top of this mountain. And I was there couldn't be a more wonderful experience in my mind. And I just I got hooked from there. I decided that I thought I wanted to climb Everest. So I was Googling the path of how I could one day get to the top of Mount Everest. And they said, well, you should try and, make sure you can handle, again, the altitude, what it's like to be on a long expedition. So I ended up joining up with a mountain guide called Nimsdai, who has been featured on Netflix, and climbed Aconcagua with him, which is the highest mountain in South America. And then eventually went and climbed that first ever 8,000 meter peak that I ever saw, Manaslu, and reached the summit of that, which it just blew my mind that only a couple of years ago I had never done anything even remotely like that. And now I was there in Nepal, reaching the summit of an 8,000 meter peak. And it was also really fascinating to me that when I spoke to the Himalayan database, there were only 6 Canadian women ever to have done that at the time that I'd done that I climbed it. And I was the youngest. I mean, it's a very tenuous title, but it reminded me of what a rare and beautiful opportunity it had been. But it also, when I was at base camp, I'm a writer. That's still my number one profession. And I just kept thinking, I couldn't stop thinking about what story was here, because there was definitely a story. And I didn't know if it was going to be, I didn't think it was going to be a memoir, because I wasn't quite ready for that. I didn't think. I thought it was going to potentially be a fantasy, around a mountain climb or something like that, or science fiction. And then I thought, no, I'm here at base camp as a single woman, and all around me are these sort of really macho, really high achieving, really kind of powerful men. There's no police. You're in an environment that is incredibly dangerous, where people lose their lives, almost through no fault of their own, whether that's altitude sickness or crevasse danger or avalanche danger. And I wrote to my agent, who is also a very good friend and who was very worried about me during all this kind of crazy mountain climbing that I was doing. And I said to her, I think there's a thriller here. And she's like, when you get back, you're going to sit down and you're going to write that thriller. And as I said, I've never thought about doing an adult book, but this story was just one I knew that I had to tell. And there was so much that I faced that I could see, if it had turned on a dime, how dangerous and how thrilling it could be. And so being the kind of, a storyteller by nature, I knew that that's what I wanted to do, was sort of take that experience and kind of really amp it up and kind of bring it to its fore, and also feature some of the incredible women that I was seeing who are doing these adventures. Because I think that's one thing that I know was potentially a barrier to me getting into this even younger, was that you just don't see women doing it. Even when I was looking up Everest stories or Everest movies or anything, they almost exclusively feature men. Thankfully now things are starting to change, but even 5 years ago, it was all male stories. And there are some incredible women in adventure. And particularly for my next novel, Runner 13, there are some incredible female ultra runners. And it is one sport where women are competing against men and winning, beating them on the exact same sort of terrain and courses, because, they're just trailblazers. And when it comes to endurance events, sometimes women are the ones who have the upper hand. And that's really great for me.
Thanks for sharing your story and for opening up like that. That's truly inspiring to see where you've begun and where you've gone. Because when you read your bio, I was really like, man, I feel so unaccomplished, like where you've been. But I love seeing this. But so as you were just mentioning Runner 13 there, because this is the book that we kind of want to talk to you about, could you give our listeners a brief synopsis of the storyline?
Yeah, definitely. So Runner 13 is the story of a former champion ultra runner, Adrienne, who is kind of embroiled in a scandal that puts an end to her running career. And so she hasn't raced in a long, long time until she receives kind of a mysterious invite to a new race that's being held in the Sahara Desert. It's going to be 250 miles through the Sahara. And at the end, she's kind of promised something that she can't refuse. And it's a chance for her. She sees it as a chance of redemption, a chance to find some answers, and a chance to kind of get back to the sport that she once loved. But when she arrives at the race and the race begins, she soon realizes that there is a lot more at stake than she ever could have realized. And, when you're running faster than everyone else, it's really hard to escape a killer who's on your tail. So
such a good teaser.
Thank you. Yeah, she thinks she's entering what could be the race of her life, but actually she ends up on the run for her life.
Very nice. I would love to know what inspired you to write this book and how the concept of an ultra marathon kind of became the backdrop for this thriller.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I'd gone on this kind of mountaineering journey and I thought that was going to continue. And then COVID hit, and all of a sudden I was no longer able to travel out to the mountains. I wasn't able to go anywhere. I was kind of trapped in my little flat in London, and I was feeling really kind of cooped up. And the only thing I could do was go for a run around the block. And that was literally felt like the only kind of exercise I could do. So that kind of kicked off the running journey. And because I had, done this mountain climb, a lot of the climbers were also really big into their other kind of endurance sports. And so I'd had this idea of like wanting to test myself in a different kind of arena. And I'd heard about the Marathon des Sables, which is, especially in the UK, it's quite an infamous race because it's got this title as the world's toughest foot race. And there have been several kind of television shows or documentaries with people like Ben Fogle or James Cracknell who are running, these famous adventurer types. I think Ranulph Fiennes done it as well. It's kind of the ultimate running challenge. Again, 250 kilometers through the Sahara Desert in stages. So it's basically 3 marathons in a row, 1 ultra marathon, then you get a day of rest, and then another marathon, and then you're finished. So to me, that seemed, again, something absolutely inconceivable to achieve. And yet I wanted to see if I could do it. And again, when you kind of arrive in the Sahara, it's an environment that honestly takes your breath away. But the people that you meet who are doing the race alongside you are so incredible. They're so inspirational. And almost everyone has a really fascinating why as to what has brought them to that race. And the kind of intensity of mindset, especially amongst the really top ultra runners, that's required to kind of bring out your best performance in those conditions, was just absolutely fascinating to me. And so, I was totally inspired by the people that I met. And then obviously doing the race itself was by far the hardest thing that I've ever put myself through. And we had it all thrown at us from the Sahara Desert in terms of the environment. We had a 20-hour sandstorm. I was sort of navigating through the desert when I couldn't even see my hand in front of my face. We had the most extremes of temperatures. It was just incredibly beautiful, incredibly difficult. And, I spent over 60 hours on my feet running, or sometimes walking, mostly walking, sometimes running. But just putting your body through that kind of really changes you as a person. You really see what your body is capable of, or what your mind is capable of telling your body to do, when you're kind of putting so much pressure on yourself. But it also opened my whole world up to the world of ultra running. And I got totally hooked on following races like the Barkley Marathon, which are completely, bonkers, out of this world, run by someone who, asks the runners to make sure they pull specific pages out of books at certain points along the trail to make sure that they've done the whole race. And if you've lost a page, even if you complete the race, you're out.
I wanted to ask if you were inspired by the Barkley Marathon. Sorry to cut you off there, because
no, completely.
While I was reading your book, this podcast that I listened to just happened to do an episode on the Barkley Marathons, and I was like, this timing is insane. It was like,
because they are so fascinating. Because you think, why would anyone want to do this and kind of put themselves through the torture that they have to endure, but they do. And watching Jasmine Paris kind of cross the line as the first woman ever to do so, that was incredible to watch. And seeing the kind of, you really see the highs and lows of emotion that people go through. I mean, even watching the London Marathon or the New York Marathon, you see people's stories and why they're doing it and what they're putting themselves through. And it just became something that I got kind of fell down the rabbit hole of the history and the intrigue behind it. And I realized there was so much there that was so rich for storytelling. And sort of my race director in Runner 13 is kind of an even more twisted version of the guy who runs the Barkley Marathons. So I kind of, again, want to kind of amp everything up and really kind of twist the knife, I suppose it was, for my characters, until they're really pushed to their limits. And that's the beauty of fiction, I suppose.
I would just like to say that when I started running, I was like, oh, maybe I can run a half. And you're out here like, you know what? I'm going to do 250K in the Sahara Desert later, guys. Like, that is so impressive.
Thank you. I mean, it's a lot of very, very type A fun. That way. Or type 2 fun, is that what they call it? Type 2 fun. Not fun at all in the moment, but kind of funny when you look back on it.
Had you run a marathon prior? Like, what was the longest you'd run prior to going to do that?
So I had run the Edinburgh Marathon in 2012. So that was 10 years before I ran Marathon des Sables, and I hadn't run any marathon before. I've done a few halves, but again, this was all sort of a few years before the Marathon des Sables. But my times were like never anything to be impressed by. I just like plod along. But that's what kind of is fascinating to me, especially about the Marathon des Sables. Like the quickest runners are doing it in maybe sort of 25, 26 hours. And I said, I was out there for 60 hours. it becomes almost a completely different race when you have to sustain yourself. I'm not saying it was harder, but it was just completely different when you're sort of out there and enduring the heat and you're trying to keep your nutrition up and everything when you're actually out there for 60 plus hours as opposed to sort of 25. And to put into context, I think just over 1,000 people started the year that I ran. Just under 700 people finished. So there were quite a few dropouts. And I finished about 630-ish. So I was right at the back of the pack. But, it doesn't matter. I still, I did it. That was the kind of thing that's what really kind of amazed me about the whole experience. I mean, it didn't even matter to me that I got passed by an 80-year-old because it was amazing that there was an 80-year-old out on the course doing it. So, yeah.
Honestly, there's nothing more wholesome than watching a marathon go by. So, like, the fact that you were able to do that is incredible. And now I say, Rachel, you have a goal for next year.
Oh, no. I'm scared for me. One thing that we kind of wanted to talk to you about is the pacing in the book, because much like running a marathon, especially an ultra, pacing is so important in those races as well as in thrillers. So how did you kind of approach the pacing in Runner 13, especially given that the primary activity throughout the book is someone is running?
Yeah, it was really interesting because I remember talking to my editor about this, and I was like, it's kind of intriguing to me that there isn't that much fiction, considering how many people do run marathons or who get into running. There's not really that much fiction about running or featuring a marathon or anything. And he was like, yeah, that's because running in itself is not that thrilling. You're just following a marathon. You're it's hard to keep the pace up when that your character is basically doing the same activity for the entire book. And I agreed. But I think what was kind of helpful for me is obviously I kind of use a couple of points of view. One of them obviously is my main character who's racing. And I also use the point of view character of a photographer on the race who is kind of following the runners, but also involved in kind of some of the behind the scenes logistics of what's going on, which is something I also kind of found fascinating. And I talked to a lot of sort of race volunteers and directors because there's often so much drama going on behind the scenes of a race, especially, something as huge as the Marathon des Sables or, any of the massive marathons. There's so much that they're juggling. So I kind of use that, and also, jumping back and forwards in time and backstory in order to try and kind of build the tension of what Adrienne, my main character, is facing out on the course, so that when she encounters certain characters or, faces different issues, you kind of really realize what the impact of that is going to be. And hopefully that kind of helps to ramp up the tension. But it also helps, to have a setting as sort of inherently as dangerous as it is beautiful as the Sahara. And it was very much the same for the Himalayas. It's, it's really, it's an amazing tool to kind of have in my pocket to use that atmosphere and that setting to kind of ramp up the tension and the drama for the characters and kind of keep that pace, keep those people readers turning the page, which is of course what you want from a thriller.
Did you always know that you wanted to do dual POV, or was that something that kind of came to you throughout the writing process to add that tension?
I actually started off with 3 POVs, and throughout the editing process, we kind of whittled it down to the two women, which I think worked better. But I always knew that, it was going to be a multi-point of view book this time, because I wanted to show that duality. I wanted to have someone backstage, and I wanted to have someone out there on the course. So I knew from the beginning that was going to be kind of an important structure for the story. Whereas obviously with Breathless, which is just a sort of a single character POV, that was always going to be that way. But in both Breathless and in Runner 13, I also employ a kind of I forget what it's called. It's not epistolary, but there's a blog, there's a podcast in Runner 13, which also helps to kind of, set the stage and as podcasts do, provide some information for the readers. And also because they're live tracking the race, helps to kind of give some updates and context for the reader as to what's kind of going on in the race.
There's lots of twists and turns in this book, and it really keeps you guessing and going on to the next chapter. And can you talk a little bit about the process of this? Like, do you plot this all out beforehand? Like, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, it's really hard. Like I said, I never started out as a thriller writer. I started off, really, I feel like my most natural style is always leaning towards sort of fantasy, science fiction. So a lot of world building, which I do think I bring to my thrillers, especially when I choose these kind of settings, I kind of want to build that world out for the reader. So it's definitely when it comes to twists and turns and those like sort of key plot points, they take a lot of work to kind of really perfect for me. And for Runner 13, I tried to be a bit more diligent with the plotting, but again, it just seems like sometimes the characters want to go in their own directions, and even the best laid plotting plans end up getting thrown out the window. My killer or my bad guy or my bad woman, they end up shifting throughout the course of the book. And that's kind of the fun of it for me, because I feel like if I'm surprising myself, then hopefully I'm surprising the reader as well. And sometimes something will come out of left field and it feels so right that is what was happening, or that was the true motivations behind everything, that I can't believe I didn't see it from the word go. But it takes that, for me at least, it takes that process of writing the draft, of figuring out what's going on with these characters until I really kind of see what those real motivations are. And then it's a process of going back with my editors to try and really bring that out in a way, because I really like it when you feel like sort of not too led on by the author. So you feel like this is seeded through the story and hasn't come like at a total complete left field and kind of swept you off your feet. So I always try and make sure that it feels like that. And I have the privilege of having 3 editors. So I have a UK, a Canadian, and a US editor. And all 4 of us get on a Zoom a couple of times a year, and they go through the whole book, and we kind of talk it out, which is the best way for me to kind of figure out what I'm thinking. Because the best editors, which is something I learned when I was on that side of the job, the best editors never tell you, what to do to your story or how to improve it. They never tell you that. They just tell you what's not quite working for them, and then it's up to you to kind of figure out how to make it work for them. And it doesn't necessarily mean that what you've done is wrong or you need to completely change it, but there's obviously, if there's some kind of disconnect with those early readers, there's something there to work on. I really value that insight and advice, because sometimes when you're that close to a book or a project, or when you're trying to put out one a year and you're really kind of working at a really quick pace, it really helps to have those second and third opinions.
I'm kind of curious what the research process for this book was like for you, because like you've mentioned, you've run an ultra in the Sahara, which is wild. But in the book, you have your elite runners, who are the people who, like in the race you did, finish in those like 24, 25 hours. You have fun runners, you have photographers, race coordinators. How did you gather all of this information and distill it into this book?
Yeah, it was a lot. But I think part of it is my slightly obsessive personality. When falling down the rabbit hole of the world of ultra running, even before I knew that I was going to write a book about it, the brilliant thing about actually the running community is that there are some incredible storytellers there as well. So I read a lot of running memoirs. I listened to a lot of podcasts, because there are some, especially after some of the big races, like the Barkley Marathons, or in the UK, we have a race called the Spine Race, the Winter Spine Race, which is, again, incredibly difficult, or after the Marathon des Sables. People come out and they tell their stories. And I was sort of absorbing all of that. And on the race itself, I was able to make some really great connections with, as I say, with some of the people who are sort of behind the scenes of the race as well. So I think it was all about trying to kind of take all of that information and absorb the stories and kind of read the running blogs and kind of really immerse myself, I suppose, in that community. But it's really interesting, because I don't necessarily think that an author has to do everything that that is that they write about, by no means. But I feel like for something like ultra running, I don't think that I could have done this story justice without having some experience of what it's like to do that. And it was kind of the same with the mountaineering, because it was like, it's really hard to, to kind of put yourself in the shoes of someone doing those kind of extreme things without kind of, I feel like for me to bring that authenticity to the story was sort of really vital to my process. So, it's kind of hard when it comes to then thinking of what I'm going to write next and what I'm going to put myself through. But I know that for, I when I wanted to do an ultra running story, I knew that I wouldn't be able to tell that or do it justice without having gone through and put myself through something like that.
Well, having put yourself through it and then writing about your kind of version is called the Hot and Sandy race. How far do you think you would have been able to get? If you were running your own mythical race, like, would you have stayed the course throughout Boone's twists and turns in your story?
Oh, that's a good question. I think the beauty of the Marathon des Sables is that it was a stage race. So I think at the moment they took the stages away, I would really start to struggle. But I really some of the stuff that Adrienne does to herself to kind of get through it, like I think she ends up watching the whole of the Lord of the Rings movies in her head. There's one part where she talks about, or she thinks about like an advent calendar of treats that she can give herself. I definitely do that to myself. I say, okay, if you make it like, except for me, instead of 10 miles, it's like 10 steps. If you get 10 steps, you can have another candy. If you go another 10 steps, you can have some water. Just like trying to incentivize myself along. So yeah, I don't think I would have made it if I had to do a huge, huge, huge chunk in one go. But never say never.
Now, you mentioned that you have 3 editors working on this, like on your projects with you. I'm really curious what you bring from your editorial past to your writing process. What are the lessons you learned as an editor that you've been able to carry over as a writer?
That's a really interesting question, because a lot of people who know about my dual background ask me that, and they say, well, why do you even need an editor if you were an editor? I was like, no, editing your own work is so completely different.
You can't cut your own hair. That's right.
Definitely. So I suppose one thing I bring to it is a real privilege, or a real sort of understanding of their importance, and so a real appreciation. That's the word I'm looking for. Appreciation for the job that they do, and the work that they do. And sometimes it helps me to. I feel like I have a little insider knowledge as to when I could maybe push a deadline, or when something is actually a really hard deadline. But I think what being an editor and working with other authors has helped with my own writing is that understanding that actually, although it can feel like such a sort of isolated profession, it works best when you do see it as a bit of a collaboration, and you kind of embrace your team who are there. They if they want to publish your book, especially, and are working towards the same goal, you're all there with the goal of making it the best book it could possibly be. And I just feel so lucky to have so many people on my support team. I kind of liken them in my acknowledgements to my support crew, that you have when you're racing the marathon or racing one of these ultra marathons. So many of the runners, they would never be able to get to the end if they didn't have that support crew along the way, feeding them their chocolate when they come into the rest stations, or giving a little massage or pep talk or whatever that's needed. My editors definitely, I appreciate them for their sort of belief in me, because sometimes that's the biggest thing that you need as an author, is just to know you have these eager, avid readers who are kind of keen to see what you've done and are as invested in your characters as you are. I have to say, having 3 voices is sometimes challenging because they don't always agree with each other. So sometimes on these Zooms we can have these, but that's the kind of, again, that's the kind of beauty of being published like this. It just means that, I really get to kind of workshop the book in a way to really hopefully deliver the best version that it can be. And they're all really great in the sense that they don't, as I say, none of my editors dominate, or dictate what they want out of me. They're just there to literally be sounding boards and advice givers and cheerleaders on this journey. But ultimately, they're just trying to drag the best book out of me. It's kind of kicking and screaming, but no, really lucky in that sense.
And how do you balance like your writing career with the life adventures that you do go on, where these books are being set in such kind of interesting and unique places? And now with the additional adventure of you being a mom, like how do you balance that? Do you have any routines or practices that help you stay productive?
Yeah, it's been tough, especially since, with the arrival of my son. And that really informed the writing of Runner 13 as well, because my main character is a mum as well. And, the way that she approaches running after that, it's a real shift in your own identity, I feel. And that was something that, I brought to the writing of this, but also because that was something that I was really facing in myself, especially in the very, very early days, newborn days. You kind of become totally subsumed into this other creature and kind of survival mode almost. And like I said, it was the first year that I didn't have a new book come out, which was kind of terrifying for me as a kind of career author, but was also really necessary kind of to have that break. But now, I'm back into it full force. And as you said, trying to kind of think up of new ideas. And I think what I've had to do is A, have a really good childcare in place, but B, also, use all of the kind of discipline and sort of committing to devoting some time, to my writing in a much more kind of structured way than I've ever had to before. So it depends what stage of writing I'm at, but for example, right now I'm in the middle of drafting my 4th thriller. So I know that I have to get my 1,000 words down, whatever it takes. So sometimes that means I end up working late into the night. Sometimes I get it all done first thing in the morning as soon as I've dropped my son off at nursery. But it's sort of like at the moment, it's just trying to get that checklist, trying to get those 1,000 words down a day, and then eventually I will have a book, and then I can and then I can work it. So it's sort of structure, but trying to be flexible with when that might be. So when he was really young, it was always his nap times, and I'm lucky, I suppose, in that because I was juggling adventures or traveling or previously to that a full-time job with writing. I think I'm used to kind of finding those moments of focus and not being too precious about it. I'm not the type of author who needs to have a certain candle like lit at my desk or like, a special pen and notebook. I can literally, I can be in a, airport waiting room, with a napkin or something and trying to get my words down. I can be anywhere. And I don't try not to use anything as an excuse, not to get some words or some imagining or something, some kind of productive work. What it has meant is that I feel like some of the other stuff has fallen by the wayside. Some of the, maybe my sort of Instagram and things like that has slightly taken a back seat. But again, I always feel like as an author, my most important part of my job is to write the next book. So that's what I focus on. And in terms of like trying to come up how to juggle like a new adventure with my son, I actually brought him on my last adventure that will feature in the next book, which was really lucky because it was slightly more in one location because I was learning how to skydive. So I was getting my skydiving license and he was there sort of sitting, toddling at the drop zone, waiting for mummy to land.
He wasn't strapped to you, though.
No, he wasn't strapped to me. I've seen some really terrible AI images of women like skydiving with a baby in a. So no, we didn't quite go that far, but he was definitely a drop zone baby for a while.
Now, like so many of your books are inspired by your real world adventures, by all of your travels. Do you have any advice for authors who want to draw inspiration or who want to include these like magnificent locations in their books?
I think the most important thing for me, even when I haven't had a book in mind for a particular adventure, for example, when I went to Antarctica, I did that long before I even knew that I was going to write a book about it. So that was my second book, which was Midnight in Canada, my second thriller. And I think and I guess this comes from potentially, being a writer, but I was sort of journaling and documenting my thoughts and feelings and experiences as much as I could during that time. I mean, it was actually the age of blogger. So I was blogging on WordPress about my adventure. adventures, and having those kind of writings and my journals and notes and photographs to look back on, I think really helps with, again, bringing that sense of authenticity to the page when it comes to write about it. But I do think that if you can incorporate the experiences that you have, I think it does show on the page. I think when someone can, even if that's in a fantasy world, like I said, the very first fantasy novel that I had published, I'd written, first of all, before I'd been, set mostly in a sort of desert-like world. And I'd never been to a desert. And when I came back from the desert, I completely rewrote those sections and my whole craft and kind of idea and my ability to build that world and that setting for a reader, came on leaps and bounds from having had that experience. So I think it's really about trying to be in the moment, when you're out there experiencing those things, take it in. That's definitely what I try and do whenever I go out and do these things, because, I don't do them for the purpose of writing a book, although maybe now I'll have to start doing some for the purpose of writing a book. But previously it's not been that. And I think just keeping my mind open and my eyes open, all my senses on high alert, that's the best way you can bring a setting or an experience to life for a reader.
Is it more challenging to write a real place versus like a fantasy world?
I think there is a pressure to kind of really do it justice. And that especially and in fact, it was interesting for Antarctica because I have to say that going to Antarctica was a completely different experience to what I thought it was going to be like before I'd had the opportunity to go. For one thing, I had no idea to expect the amount of wildlife that we saw. For me, in my head, Antarctica had been this kind of desolate, icy, and I think obviously deeper into Antarctica, it is like that, but at least on the parts that you visit when you go on an expedition cruise from south of Argentina, down to the kind of Antarctic Peninsula, you are seeing the most incredible abundance of wildlife. And obviously, I hope it stays that way. But in terms of penguins and seals and whales, I always tell people that I'd been on a couple of whale watching things, like off the coast of Nova Scotia and actually in Ireland as well. And, you feel so lucky if you see like a fluke or like a blow or something, of a whale. And, that's thrilling. And when I was in Antarctica, the captain called us on deck and there must have been 100 humpback whales around the boat, just breaching and flapping their tails and waving and just putting on this incredible show for us. And I had no idea. I had no idea that that's what that could have been, that experience was what I was about to have. Just completely blew my mind. So I think you want to, I keep harping back on authenticity, but I think you really want to, make people feel like you respected and you kind of are giving those places the kind of credit that they deserve and that they offer. And I think sometimes the only way that you can do that is really having kind of immersed yourself in that environment yourself. And it's interesting, like I said, I come from a diverse background, from different cultures. I've lived in different countries. And so I often struggle with kind of, where do I belong, or what's my identity really? Because, am I Canadian or British or mixed race, or, what is my heritage and background? And especially because it's my mom who's Chinese and I have, a dad who's Scottish. So I've got, my heritage is obscured in my name, which is, always something that I've struggled with and that, my mom has struggled with, because it feels like a kind of erasure of part of one huge side of my identity. And so I think that's one of the reasons why I find it so important to kind of bring, the most authentic version of an experience to the page that I can for a reader, because, it's all in search of kind of belonging and trying to find something that's true.
And I think there's something to be said about authenticity in writing, but in everything. Especially, it makes it so much easier for the reader to connect when they can feel that emotion and that experience coming through, even if it's fictionalized. It makes for a much, more graspable, for a lack of better words. This is why I'm not a writer, but
No,
you know what I'm trying to say.
I do know what you're trying to say. And also it's one of the reasons why I feel like I'm quite drawn to writing about women in these extreme sports and doing these kind of adventures, because they are out there and doing them, and putting it into fiction for me helps make it, again, feel more real, because of course you can, read the real life stories, which are often incredible and mind blowing, but there's something about seeing that also, happening in fiction, not just the sort of adventurous man out there, the thriller hero, but also, the women out there doing it, that makes it achievable. And it's sort of like, you can't be what you can't see. That's the kind of thing. And so I want to put, women in those environments doing those things which they are out there doing, and doing them incredibly well. I want to make them the center of my stories as well. So, and hoping that opens the door for people who might not be familiar with it, or who might not ever considered giving it a go. Rachel, you're next.
I was just going to say, unfortunately for me, when I finished this book, my first thought was, should I do an ultra? It's a terrible plan, but it's
and my first thought was, Rachel should do an ultra.
Yeah. You never know until you try.
Nice. Well, you've mentioned that your next book will have some sort of skydiving aspect, so I'm excited for that. Can you tell us anything else about what's coming up for you, or where listeners can find you online?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So I am online, Amy McCulloch Books on Instagram. That's probably the easiest way to find me. Also, my website, amymcculloch.net. And if you're interested in seeing a sort of more visual representation of Runner 13 and kind of what I went to and the story behind it, there's also a really great video on YouTube that I shot on location in Morocco to kind of give a little background of the book and the inspiration for it, and kind of really shows off the beauty of the Sahara in a really visceral way. So definitely check that out. And yeah, look out for, Runner 13, hopefully out in July in Canada and the US. And yeah, after that, more thrillers set in more extreme locations, I'm sure.
Well, we will include links to everything in our show notes so readers can find you and your books.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I can't wait to see where you come up next. You could have said the moon and I'd have been like, cool. Like, she's going to the
moon. Don't joke.
Well, Amy, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. This has been a delight.
No, I've really, really loved talking with you both. So thank you so much for having me, Kobo Writing Life.
Thank you for listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast. If you're interested in picking up Amy's books, we'll include links in our show notes. If you're enjoying this podcast, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. And if you're looking for more tips on growing your self-publishing business, you can find us at kobowritinglife.com. And be sure to follow us on socials. We are at Kobo Writing Life on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Threads.
This episode was hosted by Tara Kremen and Rachel Wharton, with production by Terrence Abrahams. Editing is provided by Kelly Robotham. Our theme music is composed by Tearjerker, and a huge thanks to Amy for being our guest today. If you're ready to start your publishing journey, sign up today at kobo.com/writinglife. Until next time, happy writing.